If you enjoy hunting Xenos in black-clad power armor, then it looks like there's some fairly good news on the horizon. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today I thought we'd have a look at the Warhammer Community Deathwatch preview, where they're showing off some of the rules that they're going to be gaining in White Dwarf, issue 453 to be precise. It's going to be essentially their Psychic Awakening update, as they've confirmed that they're not featuring in any of the books. Now I did think that this was a bit of a curious decision, particularly as I don't think that the last books would have been particularly overloaded with including Deathwatch and Harlequins in them. Maybe it was partly more of a lore and narrative perspective, rather than worrying about overloading the books with rules. At the moment, Pariah at least sounds like it might be Sisters of Battle versus Necrons, although that's certainly not confirmed yet. And throwing Deathwatch and Harlequins into that mix might not have been the worst idea ever. I don't think it would have been exactly overloaded with rules. However, that's not what they've chosen to do. They've included the Deathwatch rules in White Dwarf, and today they've shown off what looks like a good chunk of what they'll actually be getting. So without further ado, let's take a look. So first of all is the big one. Deathwatch are going to be gaining combat doctrines, much in the same way that Space Wolves, Blood Angels and Dark Angels have. Now honestly, I was a little bit surprised to see this one. I was kind of expecting Deathwatch to be treated along the same sort of lines as Grey Knights and getting some sort of other unique bonus, rather than the standard extra AP that Combat Doctrines gets you, particularly as this one's actually a reasonably decent buff to their standard special issue ammunition weapons, and anything that buffs that is generally going to be a win for the Deathwatch. So with the way that Combat Doctrines works now, it means they'll be starting in Devastator Doctrine turn 1 and then going forward to Tactical Doctrine, presumably for both turn 2 and turn 3, as that's where they'll want it for their rapid fire weapons. It is a very decent buff to the lethality of the Deathwatch units, if not quite as good as it once was, due to being forced to cycle through them as you go through. Now Combat Doctrines as it is written has some pretty interesting and slightly unhelpful combinations with Deathwatch special issue ammunition, which is really the sort of rounds that you want to be improving. Firstly, there's the way that Combat Doctrines are worded as they are at the moment, saying that they can't be stacked with any other modifier that improves AP. In the Space Marine Codex, that's not usually an issue, as those rules are quite rare, but in the Deathwatch Codex, things like the Kraken Bolts and Vengeance rounds, they do improve the AP of a weapon, so I think the rules as written, unless they word it differently for the Deathwatch, Combat Doctrines would not stack with Kraken Bolts or Vengeance rounds. I think this will be a bit of a shame in my opinion, as to just push everyone even more towards the Hellfire rounds, which are already excellent. These ones wound on a 2+, and if you could get an extra AP -1 on the round, then it's going to become a very, very decent general all-purpose weapon. Imagine a fully loaded normal kill team, dropping in with Hellfire round Stormbolters and AP -1. With a Watchmaster you could have anything up to 35 hits with that profile, meaning about 30 wounds unless you have a mission tactic. And then basically whatever the target, provided it's not a vehicle or Titanic, you've got 30 wounds at AP -1 from one strike team coming out of reserve. That's absolutely brutal. That could be 30 orcs just dead, or 7 or 8 intercessors, or around 25 guardsmen. Now presuming they did fix Combat Doctrines, which I'm certainly not guaranteed that they will, the Kraken Bolt and Vengeance round also have a bit of a limitation on them, meaning that they're capped at a certain AP. The Kraken Bolt doesn't go any higher than AP -2, and the Vengeance round doesn't go any higher than AP -3, as per the rules written on the round. This means that for intercessors with bolt rifles, they'd have already reached that maximum, so it wouldn't stack any further with Combat Doctrine help. Again, most certainly going to be pushing you towards the Hellfire round if you're engaging non-vehicles. Overall though, I do think that Combat Doctrines are a really solid buff to a Deathwatch army. Maybe not the most interesting buff ever, but they really do help out the core of the army that was already good, veterans firing Hellfire rounds out of Stormbolters or bolt rifles, so it's definitely going to make Deathwatch more fearsome on the tabletop. The next part of the rules are that they're going to be getting 14 new stratagems, though I'm a bit wary as to how new these new stratagems are really going to be. The thing is that the trend with Games Workshop updating the Space Marine rules is that they've been giving the outline chapters such as Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Dark Angels access to a bunch of the stratagems that came from Codex Space Marines, and they've typically gained access to these 15 stratagems. I think that the reason that the Deathwatch are only getting 14 is because they don't have access to Hunters or Stalkers, and one of the stratagems is Skyfire, so they wouldn't be able to use that one, hence they're probably using 14. This means that I don't think they're going to be actually getting anything unique in terms of stratagems, but they are going to be getting access to the very decent stratagems that Codex Space Marines already has. including things like Duty Eternal and, interestingly for Deathwatch, Transhuman Physiology, which would really help them out. They've shown off 5 of them in this preview, including Duty Eternal itself, with the old wording, which makes me assume that at some stage they're going to have to FAQ the codex to make it just -1 to amount of damage taken on the Dreadnought rather than -2. Either way, it's great that the Dreadnoughts have access to that now, as it brings them in line with the other codexes. Even just with the new wording at -1 damage, it's still an excellent stratagem, and Deathwatch are a little bit more reliant than most armies on their Dreadnoughts for ranged anti-tank fire support. They've also shown us Veteran Fury, which is a Deathwatch Terminator stratagem. It's basically a reprint of Fury of the First with a different name, just +1 to hits for a Deathwatch Terminator unit, which I don't think people tended to run all that much, but I guess it helps them out a little bit if you do run them with that particular niche. Perhaps more interestingly, they gain access to the 3 bolt rifle stratagems for the Intercessors. In particular, Rapid Fire is going to be absolutely brutal with Deathwatch Intercessors. This one changes the Intercessor bolt rifle to be Rapid Fire 2 rather than Rapid Fire 1, just doubling the shots that the unit puts out. Provided you're happy to pay the command point price, it means the Deathwatch Intercessors can now actually do better than the standard kill team with Stormbolters that seems to be making the competitive rounds most of the time. As say, if they deep strike in, they can still get 40 shots out with this rapid fire stratagem, and all of those shots will have an additional AP -1 due to them coming out of bolt rifles rather than coming out of Stormbolters. I wouldn't necessarily say it's flat better, as you do have to pay the command points and you lose access to those lovely storm shields, but gaining 1 additional AP and some range is certainly really cool. I think that this one will become a mainstay of Deathwatch armies and certainly makes Intercessors a lot more viable. Imagine Hellfire rounds coming out of bolt rifles with AP -2, again that's going to make a mess of anything that isn't a vehicle. The other 2 are the auto-hitting one for auto bolt rifles, again could be handy, particularly when it's special issue ammunition coming out of them. It's so much better than the standard Marine Codex one. And then there's the Stalker bolt rifle one, allowing you to snipe characters for 3 command points. I don't think anything will quite kill characters quite like 10 Intercessors armed with Deathwatch special issue ammunition and Stalker bolters, though of course it is pretty pricey at 3 CP. If you're interested, the other stratagems I think will get ported over to the Deathwatch are Big Guns Never Tire, which will be moving and shooting with Dreadnoughts, Hero of the Chapter for an additional Warlord trait, which is always nice to have the option of for 1 command point, Hammer of Wrath for mortal wounds from jump infantry, Gene-wrought Might for extra attacks for on 6s for Primaris in combat, Steady Advance, the one that allows you to use Bolter Discipline after moving, which isn't quite as relevant for Deathwatch due to them having special issue ammunition that doesn't use Bolter Discipline, Hunter Slayer Missile, the Repulsor one for throwing a mortal wound missile at the enemy, Skilled Riders for Bikers, Vengeance of the Machine Spirit to hopefully allow your Repulsor or Repulsor Executioner to fire when it dies, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, Transhuman Physiology, the one that doesn't allow you to be wounded on anything better than a 4+. For Deathwatch kill teams in particular, this one is absolutely great, being toughness 4 infantry, who are reasonably fragile but expensive enough to be worth trying to save with 2 CP. This could certainly be worth it, particularly in a Deathwatch army your opponent might genuinely be firing heavy anti-tank weapons at your kill teams, so having access to this great counter stratagem is really useful. Obviously I can't say for 100% that all of those will be included, but it seems by far the most likely bet in my opinion. Next up we come to Chaplainlessness, which again sounds like they'll be gaining the standard ones from Codex Space Marines. They tease Catechism of Fire and Recitation of Focus here, the ones that give you +1 to hit at range and +1 to wound if you're targeting the nearest targets. Both of these are good, particularly the +1 to wound one when you're targeting the nearest targets for a kill team that's just come out of Deep Strike. It means that your Kraken bolts or Vengeance rounds could actually have a decent chance of going through vehicles with some efficiency, particularly if you combined it with a rapid fire stratagem from Intercessors for example. You could potentially getting a whole ton of shots at +1 to wound. I think there's a stack with the stratagem options they have for a further +1 to wound, meaning that you could be wounding even toughness 8 vehicles with your special issue bolts on a 4+. Not bad at all in my opinion. All the other chapters seem to have got their own unique listening. I'm a bit uncertain as to whether or not the Deathwatch will get their own unique one. I sort of feel like they would have shown it off here if they were going to have one. They do only say 6 new listeners of battle, not 7. So I honestly don't think they're bothered, which to be honest is a shame. Finally, in terms of things that they have mentioned, they say that they'll also be reprinting the Deathwatch Intercessors datasheet, which will be now updated to reflect the fact that Intercessor Sergeants can take things like Thunderhammers, Power Fists and Hand Flamers, so a really solid little buff to their Fortis pattern kill teams with the Primaris units. Gaining access to Thunderhammers is the biggest thing in my opinion. and can be a really strong little melee buff to the squad, though of course you do always have the option to include aggressors in the kill team, which is another decent way of getting a whole load of damage output into the squad. One thing that I'm a bit disappointed not to see is that they've made absolutely no mention of things like Phobos pattern units or impulsors, both of which I really thought made sense to include in the Deathwatch army. I really would have liked to see an option with infiltrators, incursors and eliminators and reavers in one kill team, for example. I don't really see any reason why that couldn't be the case. It would have been a really nice little option to include to make this feel like a more flavourful update, and it could actually give Deathwatch players access to some of the cool new models. And to be honest, in my mind, the Phobos units really fit the Spec Ops elimination sort of vibe that Deathwatch have going. Also, I feel like the Impulsor is pretty much the equivalent of Primaris Rhino, and Deathwatch don't currently get access to it, which just seems a bit strange to me to deny them access to a fairly basic transport. It would also work very nicely with their Fortis kill teams, being able to throw some intercessors up the board to unload some special issue ammunition. I can only conclude that they probably don't have access to either of these, sadly, as I think that they would have shown it off in this preview to get a bit of excitement going for the Deathwatch. I'm not saying it's 100% definite that they haven't, and we might see more previews and things about it, but at the moment I'd say likely not. So overall, power-wise, I think this is actually really quite a decent update for the Deathwatch. Gaining access to combat doctrines and a bunch of the tricks of the standard Space Marines from Codex Space Marines is great, as they're already pretty darn strong with that special issue ammunition, and this might just put them over the edge to be included in Space Marine armies. Pretty much no infantry or non-vehicle target wants to get hit by these new buffed kill teams. I honestly think that they might be making some appearances in tournaments once all of that sort of thing gets going again a bit more. However, I do sort of feel that they have updated Deathwatch in pretty much the most boring possible way here. There's really nothing that we haven't seen before in one form or another in other updates, and just nothing particularly unique and flavourful. This really is just Deathwatch with a bunch of rules to make them stronger, without anything to add any particular more interest in playing the army, which I think was a bit of a missed opportunity, to be honest. Nevertheless, I'm still looking forward to seeing when we have the full rules, and I'll certainly be going through them when we get them. I'm happy that they've got a solid update in terms of power level, but I just would have liked to see a little bit more in terms of making the army more interesting. So let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. I'll most certainly be making an overview of kill teams and intercessor kill teams, and maybe a few other units and rules from the Codex as well, if there's interest for them. So if any of that would interest you, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. If you'd like to help keep these videos coming, I do have a Patreon page which is down in the description below. Basically making all of these videos twice a day really takes quite a lot of time that I have to dedicate away from my normal job now. If you are watching regularly, then any support is greatly appreciated. There are a few other benefits on the Patreon page, such as seeing some videos early, voting on what comes next for the channel, and the occasional prize draw where I give away some free miniatures. So if any of that sounds interesting, or you've just been enjoying the content, feel free to support, and have a look at that link down in the video description. In any case, a big thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.